Right, everyone, Zoom, you still hear me all right? Excellent. All right, so we'll say good morning, good morning. Incredible daf ahead of us today, beginning by thanking all of our sponsors, to thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Adar. Stephen Terry Zinn, for dedicating all of Shurim Joshos this month in memory of Terry's father, Tzvi Hirsch ben Yosef HaKohen. To thank Paul and Kathy Pollack for dedicating all the Shurim Joshos this month in memory of Paul's grandfather, Zechariah ben Zechariah, and grandmother, Dina Bas Dov. To thank our Week of Learning sponsors, an anonymous sponsorship, Le'ilu Nishmas Moshe Aaron Alter ben Yosef Binyamin, and Sarah Dina Bas Elimelech. We thank our Daf Yomi sponsor for today, Mel Ram, Le'ilu Nishmas, his grandmother, Esther Bas Yaakov. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, all of the Neshamos Lavan Aliyah and the families Ein Nechama. Well, so with that, let us begin. Today's Daf is Lamed Hey 35. And we are picking up in Meretz Hashem on Lamed Hey. So remember again, yesterday we left off the kind of like the Gemara went, we really expanded the scope of our conversation, but let's just kind of refocus a little bit. Our Mishnah, which is very exciting because now, first of all, and of course, a Mazel Tov to Dr. Lustman on the engagement of his granddaughter yesterday. Mazel Tov, and Meretz Hashem, we should be zochet this year, go down to the Chuppah b'Shah Tova u'mitzlachos. Mazel Tov. So yesterday in the Mishnah, new parak, we were introduced to this really interesting idea, namely about the prohibitions, core prohibitions of Nazirus. It's interesting, I mentioned this before, it's always interesting. You would think that like this would be the beginning of the Masechta, right? Because here we're actually getting into the mechanics of how Nazirus works, but okay, we see how Shas is set up often. So in any event, there are three core prohibitions, right? What are the three core prohibitions? Number one, Tuma. Number two, right, ritual purity. Number two, taglachas, inability to get a haircut. And number three, called the lashon of the Mishnah is yotzei min hagefen. That which comes from grapes. Mishnah spoke about the idea of four core things that are yotzei min hagefen, right? Number one, the grape itself, right? Number two, grape skins. Number three, grape seeds. And number four, wine. Okay, that was the Mishnah. The Gemara said, interestingly enough, what's missing from the Mishnah's leaves, right? Leaves and shoots of the vine. So Rabbi says, remember again, the Gemara said, you see from here that the Mishnah does not reflect the view of Rabbi Elazar. Why? Because Rabbi Elazar is one who holds that leaves and shoots ultimately again are going to be asr. So therefore, I will say, it turns out that there is a fundamental machlokes between Rabbanan and Rabbi Elazar, namely about the prohibition of leaves and shoots. Rabbanan say it's not a problem. Rabbi Elazar says it is a problem. So I will say, the Gemara said, what is at the core of that machlokes? And this is when everything got a little wild, right? So I will say, so what is at the core of their machlokes? It's an exegetical machlokes. How do we darshan the psukim? So remember again, Rabbi Elazar darshans ultimately again ribui and miut. The Rabbanan darshan a klal and prat. So what we spent yesterday's daf on, or we're going to spend the majority of today's daf on, is to go ahead and explain how those so what ended up happening. So they each darshaned and gleaned their respective positions, and then the Gemara kind of just went on to discuss the ramifications of their klal prat or ribui and miut. So we'll say with that we pick up top of Lamed Hey. Literally first line, end of the first line. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah to kamokim lahai mechartzonim va'adzag lomer. So now the Gemara says like this, a little bit of a side point. According to Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah was in our Mishnah. Remember again, what did Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah say in our Mishnah? He wanted to suggest, it's actually quite interesting, that a person is not chayiv for violation of their neder nazirus until you eat 2 grape skins and a grape seed. Right? Shnei chartzonim ol Rabbi Elazar da ben Azariah de kamokim ba mehai chartzonim va'adzag. Lomar sheinu. So I'm sorry. Before we read it, so Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah said in the Mishnah, you only chayiv if you eat 2 grape skins and a grape seed. So I'll say, what's the pshat? Now, first of all, where does he get that from? So I'll say, this is fascinating. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah gets it from the lashon of the pasuk. The lashon of the pasuk itself is mechartzonim vi'ad zag. It's fascinating. That's the way the Torah describes the prohibition of the Nazir. So the way everyone else in the world reads that pasuk, I will say, is what? The Nazir can't eat anything from what? from the grape skins to the grape seed. So in other words, what's the image? What's the imagery? The whole grape. The whole grape. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah feels, no. What the Torah is actually giving you is a shear. What's the shear? What's the amount for prohibition for a Nazir? Mechartsonim. Chartsonim will say is what? Plural, right? The minimum number of a plural is what? I know that wasn't good English, but you say, right? 2. So chartsonim means 2 grape skins. Ad zug. Zug means what? A grape seed, singular. And therefore, again, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, it's fascinating. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah says the shear ultimately is 2 grape skins and 1 grape seed. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, the kamokim lahai, mechartsonim va'adzag, lomar, to teach you, she'eno chayev, we'll say lamen hamad aleph 3 lines down, lomar she'eno chayev ad she'yochal beis chartsonim v'zag, that you're only chayev if you eat 2 grape skins and 1 seed. Prata minale, where does he learn the prat from? To which the Gemara says, Sarvala Krabelazar, the Darish miut veriba. Okay, Shabbos says it's very simple. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah aligns himself ultimately again. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah aligns himself with Rabbi Elazar, who darshins miut veriba. Fine. V'bai, same with other possibilities, kirabanan. They know he aligns himself with Rabbanan, who darshin klalu prat, and he says as follows: because if it was true, just Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah said, "Lichtevei rachmana lahai mechartsonim va'adzag gabe prate." So I'll say if that's the case, ultimately the pasuk should have written mechartsonim va'adzag by the prat part of the pasuk, right? By the specific part of the pasuk. Lemay hilchasa kasvei basar klal. Why does the Torah position this phrase after the general statement? Shmamina lemedayne biklal uprat. It must be in order to go ahead and darshan it through the lens of klal and prat. Ve'ema kule lahachi hudasa. Maybe the entire pasuk comes to be part of the klal uprat. Imkain lichtov. So we'll say if that's the case, it should have just said, "Oh shnei chartsonim, oh shnei zogim." See, I will say, what Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah finds interesting about this pasuk is that it's not phrased symmetrically, right? In other words, the pasuk should have either phrased it plural for both chartsonim and zogim, so literally means 2 chartsonim, 2 zogim, or chartson v'zog, or say them both singular. Instead, the pasuk writes it chartsonim plural ad zag singular. To which the Gemara says, "L'may hilchasa kasav rachmana mechartsonim va'adzag." So why does the pasuk ultimately go ahead and write it plural and then singular? Shmamina lemidrash be klal uprat. In order to darshan it ultimately as part of the klal uprat. However, v'ikinami lemidrash be ad shiochal shnei chartsonim v'zag. But you can still darshan it as Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah does to give you a shear for achila as well. So Rabbi say what the Gemara is suggesting over here is that Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah ultimately is able to dual purpose the drush, or dual purpose the phrase. So mechartsonim v'adzag. On one hand, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah says could be part of the klalu prat of the Rabbanon, and could also give you a shear for achila of prohibition. That the shear for achila for the Nazir is going to be 2 grape skins and 1 grape seed. I will say, by the way, I'll just point out to you that 1 seed. So I will say, so again, that was the Mishnah. So I will say, so remember again, I just want to point out to you the side machlokis over here, which is the definition of chartsonim and zog. Right, so remember again, that was the end of the Mishnah. That does chartsonim mean grape skins or grape seeds? So we're just leaving aside that machlok. It's just going with the pasha pshat that chartsonim refers to the grape skins and zug refers to the grape seeds. So just keep that other machlokas in the back of your mind. Fine. So it says the Gemara, Rabbi Elazar, the darish miut veriba. Prat uklal minale. Okay, so we'll say, so now we're pausing here for just a moment. So here's what we have. We're going back for just a moment as we started the shir today. We have our fundamental machlokes ultimately between Rabbi Elazar and between the Rabbanon. Namely, again, specifically about the ability to go ahead and eat leaves and shoots of the vines. Rabbi Lazar is saying you are not allowed to eat it. It's included under the prohibition of the Nazir. Ultimately, again, and the Rabbanan saying you are permitted to go ahead and eat it. So remember, this entire discussion up until now was about the Ribui and Miut of Rabbi Lazar, Klal and Prat of the Rabbanan. We just expanded that conversation. Now the Gemara is going back for just a second, asking like this. Rabbi Lazar, you hold that the way we dash in the prohibitions of Nazirus is through a Ribui and a Miut. So now the Gemara says, Rabbi Lazar the Darish Miut v'Riba, Prat uklal, I should say Prat uklalu Prat menale. So this is an interesting question. It's an interesting question. The Gemara, so let's just translate it and then let's try to understand what the Gemara is actually asking. Rabbi Lazar, so you darshan Ribui and Miut. From where do you darshan Prat uklal uprat? Now, what is the Gemara asking? So if you look at the Rush, this is actually quite interesting. So the Rush says over here, again, left-hand margin. In my Rush, it's 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 13 lines down. Bolded lines, listen to this. He says, the Darish kule oraisa beribui umeute, visavar the klal uprat uklal eina mida batora. So Rabbi say, according to the Rush, what the Gemara is asking is, and this is fascinating, The Gemara says, Rabbi Lazar, do you hold that the entire Torah is only to be dashed with a ribui, a miut, and a ribui, and that maybe klalu prat is not a legitimate exegetical principle? We'll say, isn't that riveting? Isn't that absolutely riveting question? That maybe there's a school of thought that says klal uprat uklal, or for that matter, prat uklal uprat. We're going to see their sister concepts. Maybe there's no such exegetical principle like this. Varminan telo darish nami prat uklal uprat. The Rabbi Avo in the prat uklal uprat darish. Shabbos says, listen to this. What the Gemara is asking is like this. What I was trying to figure out over here. When we say that Rabbi Lazar darshans ribui and miut, does that mean that he darshans ribui and miut what? To the exclusion of ever darshaning klal uprat uklal, or say klal uprat? Or no, Rabbi Lazar will agree that there is an exegetical principle of klal uprat. It just happens to be over here by Nazir that he darshans it how? By ribui and miut. So that's the shayla Rabbi said. Listen to this. Rabbi Avo. So Rabbi says, no. Even Rabbi Lazar will agree that the concept of klal uprat applies. So where does he learn it out from? Rabbi Avo, nafkile mehaikra. He learns it from the following pasuk. I will say the pasuk the Gemara is going to quote over here is in the case of shomer sachar. Right? What's a shomer sachar? Remember again, is a paid custodian. Paid custodian. So what's that? The Torah says, "V'chiyitem ish arehu chamar oshar oseh." So I will say, so the pasuk. Let me read to you the pasuk in its entirety. The pasuk is the chiyitin ish re'ehu, a person will give to his friend to watch. Right. So remember again, the re'ehu, we'll call him Ruvain, is the owner of the item. He's giving it to Shimon. Shimon is the shomer. In this case, Shimon is a shomer sachar, a paid custodian. So what is Ruvain giving to Shimon? Chamar, donkey; shar, ox; seh, sheep; b'chol behema, or any animal; lishmar, ultimately to guard it. So I'm just reading the pasuk. Umeis, the animal dies. O nishbar, it's broken. O nishba, it's lost. Ein roa, no one sees it. So remember again, this is a shomer sachar. Sees chayiv, right? The shomer sachar, a paid custodian, is chayiv for gneva va'aveda, right? He's chayiv again where the animal is lost or stolen. So now watch this. See, here we go. So the Gemara says, "V'chiyidei ishareu chamar oshar oseh prat." So we'll say when the pasuk says the person will give to his friend to watch, right? A donkey, an ox, or a sheep. That's a prat. Right? They will say, why is that a prat? Right? That's a specific. We're identifying specific animals, right? A donkey, an ox, or a set. That's a prat. V'chol behema. Then it says, or any animal. They will say, what's that? Klal. Right? A general statement. Lishmar, to watch. Chazar uparat. That's once again a prat. So we'll say, what do you have over here? Prat, uklal, uprat. Right? So I have a specific statement, right? A general statement, and a specific one. Prat uklal uprat. So we'll say, what's the halacha? Iatadan elakeina prat. So we'll say in general, whenever you have a concept like this of a prat uklal uprat, ultimately again it comes to say that even the klal is governed by the prat. So I will say, so again, we're not going to get into. So if you take a look, by the way, Rashi says over here. Oh yes, all right. So I'll show this to you because it's actually quite interesting. Rashi says, "Kitin ishareu chamar osha oseh prat v'chol behem aklal v'afilu dubim v'arayos lishmar chazu parat iatadan el keina prat dahani prat basra lemidi debar shmirahu." Shabbos says very interesting. In other words, if it would have just said the klal, right, the klal lemina behema, I would have thought that even if the owner, let's say, Reuven gives Shimon a lion to watch, right, or a bear to watch. So I might have thought that even Shimon, the shomer, would be chayav for that. So then Rabbi say the prat comes along and says, no. What kind of animal? Shar, seh, chamar, or chamar, shar, seh, an animal that is capable of being guarded. That's the prat. Right? So the prat tells you that even the klal ultimately only refers to an animal that's capable of being guarded. Okay, the Rush has a different drush in all of this. If you take a look at the Rush is over here, v'haikra, Yitin ish el re'ehu, tarshu rabbanan parakazah, b'chlal u'prat u'klal, u'mamtinan minei avodim, shtaros u'karkaos. So this is interesting. The Rush says, no. The prat u'klal u'prat comes to limit that is dafka animals that a shomer sachar is going to be chayiv for. But let's say again, Reuven entrusted Shimon with avodim, slaves, karkaos, land, shtaros, documents, and something happens. Ultimately, again, Shimon will not be chayiv for that. Why not? The Rush says over here, so I said, just point out over here, like I said, it's not the drush itself is not really so important for us right now. What is important for us is the Gemara is suggesting, the Gemara of Rabbi Avo, the Gemara is asking, Rabbi Lazar, you darshan ribuy and mio. Tell me, do you ever darshan prat uklal uprat? To which Rabbi Avo says, yes. Where does he darshan prat uklal uprat? Shomer sachar. Shomer sachar, minach, right? Chamor, shar, seh, prat, behema, klal, lishmar, prat, klal, and prat, and even Rabbi Lazar darshans that. Fine. Rava Amarava says, nafklei mehaikra. Rava wants to give a different suggestion. What's Rava's suggestion? V'im min, prat, let me read you the pasuk in its entirety. The pasuk is v'minat son karbano. If he's going to bring a carbon from sheep, Rabbi say this pasuk is by karbanos. If he's going to go ahead and we'll go and see by a carbon ola. Pasuk says v'minat son karbano. If he's going to bring a carbon from son, minaksavim or minaizim laola. Zachar tamim yakrivenu. So we'll say if he's going to go ahead and bring a carbon from tzon, minaksan from a izim, right? Female sheep, male sheep. Well, for ola, zachar tamim, he has to bring. From sheep or from rams. Ultimately, again, zachar tamim yakrivenu. He has to bring an unblemished zachar. So watch this. So Rava learns that from here. Rava says, v'im min, and if he will bring prat. That is a prat. That's the limiting statement. Tzon, klal, kvasim, v'izim, chazer, uparat. So this is a prat, uklal, uprat, i'atadan ela ke'ein haprat. Ultimately, again, you can only darshan the klal through the lens of the prat. I'll say, take a quick look at Rashi over here. So then we'll look at the Rashi also. Rashi says, Rav Amra mehaikra, v'minat tzon karbano, minaksavim, o mina'izim, li'ola zachartam yakribenu, min prat, Hatson klal, va'afilu rova v'nirva muksa v'ne'evad esnan u'mechir shekshim l'karban. Shabbos, now listen to this. From the klal itself, from son itself, I would have thought that even if you had a sheep that was sodomized, right, or a sheep engaged in an act of bestiality, or a sheep that was used for avodah zarah, I might have thought that such a sheep could be used for a carbon as well. That's based on the klal. So the prat comes to say that no, you can't use such a sheep. Now I will say, if you look at the Rush for just a moment, it's just interesting halachas over here. If you look at the Rush, so the Rush is Rava Amar, Ba'ai nami mushkachas the midrash prat uklal prat dichsev v'minatzon karbano minaksavim mina'izim liola min prat Demashma miktsas son velo cold son lafuke rova venirva. So we'll say now. Listen to this. So halacha lamaisa. So remember, here's the way it works. Min is a prat. Son is a klal. I would have thought, therefore, based on son, you could use any sheep, even if the sheep was engaged in an act of bestiality, even if the sheep was used for avodah zarah. Therefore, I will say what happens. Therefore, the Torah gives me another prat to teach me that what? If you skip down a little bit, min prat demashma miktsas behema velo kol behema. Ultimately, I will say comes to teach me once again some sheep, not all sheep. Halacha l'maisa again, a sheep that was engaged in bestiality, used for avodah zarah, ultimately cannot be used for a korban. I will say, but listen to this. So what does the prat and klal, however, what does the klal help you with? So Rabbi say, not every sheep used in an isser can't be used for a korban. For example, Rabbi say, if you went ahead, the halacha is you're not permitted to plow your field with two different types of animals. Right? So if you did so, it's kilayim. If you did so, you could still use that sheep. Let's say you plowed your field with a sheep and a donkey. Right? Halacha l'maisa, you could still use that sheep as a korban. Wherein lies the difference? In the first case, the bestiality or avodah zarah, the guf itself of the sheep was used for an avera. That's when the sheep can't be used for a korban. But when the body itself was not defiled, then ultimately, again, the sheep can be used for a korban. Okay, like I said, I will say, the specificities of it are not what the Gemara is driving at over here. What is the Gemara driving at over here? We'll say, what are we trying to accomplish? Let's get to remember what your goal is. What's our goal? To show that Rabbi Elazar darshans prat and klalu prat, that he's not just a ribui and miut guy, that he holds of this other exegetical principle as well. Good. So we have two different approaches, two different sources. Rabbi Ava says Rava has his. Fine. Amar Rabbi Yehuda, midiskarta Rava, v'leilaf min hadinkra. So we'll say, so Rabbi Yehuda midiskarta says to Rava, why are you learning out from here? Watch learn from the following pasuk. Min prat habehema klal. Bakar v'tzon. So we'll say here, the Gemara says like this, here's the pasuk. Dabrel b'nei Yisrael Marta, Adam kiakriv mikem karban laHashem. If a person will bring a carbon to Hashem, mina behema, mina bakar, mina tzon, takrivas karban chem. So comes along Rabbi Yehuda Midiskart and says to Rava, why not learn it out from this pasuk? In other words, you're learning out from pasuk around karbanos. Let me give you a better pasuk. Here it is. Min, now we're going to break up the pasuk. Min is a prat, right? A specific statement. Ha behema, klal, general statement. Bakar v'tzon, chazar parat. Ultimate bakar and son, once again, specific statement. So we'll say, what do you have in this pasuk? Prat, uklal, uprat. So I have a prat, right? So again, a prat, min, klal, behema, prat again afterwards. Good. I'm sorry. Min, prat, klal, right. Bakar v'tzon, chazar parat. Good. So what do you see from here? Iyatadan, elkein, prat. So we'll say, so again, all that's happening over here, Rabbi Yehuda of Diskart is saying, Rava, instead of using the pasuk that you used, why don't you use this particular pasuk? Amarlei min hai leka lamashmene. So we'll say, Rava says to Rabbi Yehuda of Diskarta, no, you cannot darshan from that pasuk. Why can't you darshan from this pasuk? Listen to this, I will say. Dimi hasam, because Rava says, Dimi hasam, havamina, I would have thought as follows, habehema, when the pasuk says behema amud beis, chaya bichlal behema. I would have thought ultimately again that ha behema comes to include even a chaya. Amar lei chaya bichlal behema. Rabbi said this takes us back, if you remember again, Rabbi said to the last mission of the previous parak, where he spoke about kai. Remember again, he spoke about kai in halacha, two different types of designation, a chaya and a behema. Now remember again, there are a few different ramifications regarding chaya and behema, both for chelev, kisei hadam. So he says, so Rava says, you can't use this pasuk to darshan, klalu prat to klal. Why not? Or prat to klalu prat? Why not? Because halacha l'maisa from this pasuk, I would have thought when it says habehema, it comes to include even chaya. So the Gemara says, what? Why would you assume that chaya is bichlal behema? Haksiv bakar v'tzon. The pasuk says bakar and son. So I will say bakar and son are clearly not chaya. V'habile prat uklal. So I will say because this could have been just a pasuk of prat and klal. In other words, Rava is disagreeing, and Rava feels that this is not a klalu prat, a prat to klalu prat, but rather it's just a case of prat and klal. Now I will say, here's interesting, get a little bit technical, I guess it's all been technical, but havile prat to klal, v'atadan elkein ha-prat. I will say, interestingly enough, according to Rava, this last pasuk, Rabbi Yehuda of Diskarta Darshan, is not a case of klal uprat to klal. Instead, it's a case of klal and prat. Klal and prat. And when you have a case of klal uprat, I will say, how do you darshan a klal uprat? Iyatadan ela ke'ena prat. In that case, ultimately, again, the klal itself is only darshaned through the lens of the prat. Okay? Uminalan dahachiu. How do you know that? How do you know that? That in general, again, when you have a klal and prat, ultimately it's only darshan through the lens of the prat. The sanya, so is actually very interesting. Okay, so we'll say, let me read to you again the pasuk in its entirety. This is by Meiser Sheni. Right, so we know what's halacha by Meiser Sheni. Meiser Sheni belongs to who? Belongs to who? Belongs to the owner of the produce. Right? It's Meiser Sheni. But what's the halacha? You have to take it and what? Eat it in Yerushalayim. Now, what happens if you have, Baruch Hashem, too much produce to transport, or for that matter, you live too far away? So the concern that by the time you get to Yerushalayim, the produce is going to rot. What can you do? You could exchange it, right? You could redeem your Meiser Sheni onto money, but there are guidelines for what you could use your Meiser Sheni money on in Yerushalayim Mir HaKodesh. Let me read you the pasuk first outside. So the pasuk says, "V'nasata kesef b'chol asher ta'aveh nafshecha." You could use the money for whatever you want, but specifically, ba'bakar, ubatzon, ba'yayin, ubashechar. So you could use it, we'll say, bakar, cattle, tzon, sheep, yayin, wine, shechar, also wine, or in this case, could also mean other alcoholic beverages. Ubechol asher tishalcha nafshecha. Whatever you like. You shall eat there being Yerushalayim before Hashem your God. And you'll rejoice that you and your household. Okay, so now watch how the Gemara breaks up this pasuk. Here we go. So this pasuk, by the way, I just want to point out once you begin to kind of look at the Torah through the lens of let's say klal and prat to klal, it's amazing how you read psukim differently, right? They will say now you can see it. In other words, if somebody tell you, okay, close your Gemara, show you the pasuk, break up the klal and prat to klal, you could do it, right? And it's so fascinating to see how HaKadosh Baruch Hu structured his Torah in such a fascinating way. So watch this. So we'll say you'll spend the money on whatever you want. What is that? Klal, right? Anything you want, klal. Then what? Babakar, ubatzon, bayayin, ubashechar. I will say, what is that? Prat. So now again, you gave me a general statement to klal, right? I could go ahead and spend the money on whatever I want. Then you went ahead and said I could use the money ultimately again, right? For yayin, for bakar, tzon, yayin, shechar. So again, cattle, sheep, wine, shechar. Prat, specific. Ubechol asher tishalcha nafshecha. And then again, pasuk says you can use it for whatever you want. Once again, chazar v'klal. So I'll say, what do I have over here? So I'll say, so this is actually interesting. This is a case of klal, prat, klal. We were talking about before, prat, klal, prat. So this is now general, specific, general. So I'll say, so now what happens over here? So klal uprat uklal. So what do I do in a case of klal uprat uklal? Iya tadan ela ke'ein haprat. So I will say the way this works with the klal uprat uklal, I will say is how is the prat itself is defined through the lens of the klal. Iya tadan ela ke'ein. I'm sorry, right? The klal is iya tadan ela ke'ein haprat. The prat. So, okay, here's what's happening over here. So I will say, what do you do with a pasuk like this? Where on one hand, the Torah is telling you could have everything, but then it's saying you could have these things, and then it says you could have everything. So what do you do? So I will say, essentially what we do is like this. The everything is modified or is defined by the prat, or the klal itself is defined for the prat. The klal is limited, or the klal is constricted by the details of the prat. So it turns out, I will say, what's the role of in a klal prat to klal? What's the role of the prat? What's the role of the prat? To give you the details of the klal, right? The klal itself includes everything. The prat is there to tell you no. The prat is there to give you the details, I'm looking for the right word. To give you the details through which you'll darshan the klal. It'll become clear in just a moment. Here it is. Iyatadan elakein prat. Ma prat mefurash. Here it is, Rabbi say. What's the prat? The Rabbi say, what is the common denominator? Watch this. What's the common denominator between yayin, son, bakar, son, yayin, shechar? What's common denominator amongst those four things? Here we go. Pre, they each come from something else. Right? In other words, sabakar and son, right, come from a mother, right? Yayin, shechar, both come from a grape, right? This is that from a grape. So this is a pre, vigidule karka, and they grow from the ground. They grow from the ground, right? Animal, both say, an animal is considered to be gidule karka because the animal is nourished from the ground. So therefore, I will say, here's what's fascinating. So it turns out the role of the prat is to give you the parameters for the klal. So the Torah, in other words, the role of the prat, because I will say, you can't just say that all you could spend your money on is what? Son, bakar, yayin, shechar. Why can't you say that? Why don't you just say, the Torah told me, what can I use the money on? Son, bakar, yayin, shechar. Why can't you say that? Because you have a klal. Remember again, I can't ignore the klal. I have two klals, because there's a case of klal and prat to klal. So I cannot ignore the klal. That I can't do. On the other hand, I also can't what? I also can't just use whatever I want. I can't use money for whatever I want because the Torah does give me a prat. So I'll say, so what is the interplay between the prat and the klal? So now I see it. It's so beautiful. The prat is there to develop the criteria for the klal. That's what's happening over here. So when you look at son, bakar, yayin, and shechar, what's the common denominator amongst all of those things? Number one, pre. They all come from something else. And number two, they're all nourished from the ground. Oh, so now I understand. Son, bakar, yayin, shechar is not coming to tell me that the only things I can spend my Meiser Sheni money on are those four things. They're coming to define the klal. Now the klal says anything that satisfies those four criteria, or those, right, pre, that's two criteria, right? Pre comes from something, and gidule karka, you could use your Meiser Sheni money. It's incredible. Af kol pre or gidule karka. Beautiful. So we'll say, by the way, this is just the Gemara showing me how we darshan a klalu pratu klal. So now I understand klalu pratu klal, kein prata daininan. Fine. So now I understand that in a klal uprat uklal, the role of the prat is to give me the criteria through which I darshan the klal. Incredible. Klal basra my ahani. So I will say, what does the last klal add? In other words, so why can't I just do a klal and prat and say the same thing, right? I have a klal, a general statement, a prat, a more specific statement, and just say that the prat is there to give me the criteria for the klal. What does the last klal add? Mayahani, so the Gemara says, klal basra, mayahani, ahani la sufe called the domile. So I will say, see, here's what's interesting. No, the Gemara says, with just the klalu prat, again, a klalu prat would just tell you that all you could have is the prat. The last klal ultimately says anything that resembles the prat in its given criteria is permitted to be used as well. V'su, prat uklal uprat. So I will say that was a klal uprat uklal. What about the reverse? What about prat uklal uprat? So I will say, so again, remember, this is the case. Ultimately, prat is the limiting statement, the specific statement. Klal is the general statement, and then a prat. So I'll say, so again, interestingly enough, we kind of darshan it the same way. It's ke'ein haprat daininon. Ultimately, once again, everything is darshaned through the criteria set down by the prat. If that's the case, prata basra mayahani, what does the last prat do for you? To which the Gemara says, Ilah prata basra, were it not for that last prat, hava mina nase klal mosaf ala prat. Rabbi will say, this is fascinating. Without the second prat, is incredible. I would have thought that the klal is coming to add on to the prat. See, Rabbi will say, here's what's interesting. It's kind of the same answer, but just in the reverse. If you would have just had, right, a klal and a prat, I would have thought that the prat comes to limit the klal, right? That last klal says, no, the prat is coming to give you the criteria, and then the last klal is coming to go ahead and give you all the things you could add in. Similarly, again, in a case of a prat and klal, I would have thought that perhaps the last klal is coming to totally expand the prat. Therefore, the prat that follows says, no, you can add on something, but ultimately, again, the something you add on is still limited by the criteria of the prat. It's so incredible. So, ilav prata basra hava mina nasa klam mosaf ala prat. Fine. Michti, train klali uprata, utrain prati uklala. So now let's analyze this a little bit more. So now I have two klals in a prat, right? Or two prats in a klal. So I will say train klali uprati is klal, prat, klal. Train prati klala is prat, klal, prat. So ke'ein prata daininan. Then I will say what's interesting is it seems to be that the result of both of those exegetical principles is the same, right? I will say, isn't that interesting? Whether you have a klal, prat, uklal, or a prat, klal, prat, either way, it sounds like what's happening over here. The prat is there to give you the criteria, and ultimately, again, the klal allows you to expand the prat as long as what? As long as what? The expanded items conform to the same criteria of the prat. If that's the case, the Gemara says, Ma'ika beini beini. What's their sinim? They both seem to be doing the same thing. Right? In both of these cases, whether you have a klalu pratu klal or a pratu klalu prat, the prat is there to give me the criteria. The klal is there to expand beyond the stated pratim. So wherein lies the difference between these two exegetical principles? To which the Gemara says, so my Ika beini ubeini, so Ika di'ilu tartin klali upratis, listen to this. So I will say, because again, in a case of two klalu pratu klal, prata dedamile afilu bechad sad marbinon. So I will say, this is so exciting. This is so exciting because I will say, you have to understand, for us, this seems like a lot of detail, right? But I will say, I just want to point out, for the Gemara, this is the very lifeblood of the Gemara. I will say, this is how the magic happens. In other words, these exegetical principles is exactly how Chazal make all of their drashas. When Chazal look at a pasuk, I will say, the way they know what to go ahead and include or exclude, this is it. This is it. So for us, this is like, okay, my head's swirling a little bit, right? But this is it. I will say, so now watch this. So what the Gemara is asking, which is a fundamental shaila, is, I don't understand. At the end of the day, where we are right now is whether you're darshaning klalu pratu klal or pratu klalu prat, the result seems to be the same, which is the prat is there to give you the criteria, and the klal is there to expand the pool, as long as the pool conforms to the criteria. So what's the difference in the drashas? So here we go. I'll say, here it is. So the ilu tartin klal prata. I'll say, here we go. When you have a klal and pratu klal, i'ika prata damile afilu bechad sad marbinon. I'll say you can include anything that conforms to at least one criteria, as long as it's similar to the prat in at least one way you could include it. Trei prati uklali, but I will say when you have a prat uklalu prat, i'ika prata dedami mishneit stadin marbinon. Bechad tzad lo arin. I will say this is fascinating. When you have a klalu prat uklal, all you need is the thing to resemble the prat in one way in order to be included. When you have a prat uklal uprat, ultimately the only way to include something I will say is how? Is if the new item resembles the prat in all of the criteria. Incredible. So michti prat uklal v'naase klal mosaf ala prat v'israbi komili. So I will say, so therefore again, when you have a prat and a klal, what do you do with a prat and a klal? I will say, in that case, ultimately the klal comes to go ahead and expand the prat and include everything. Umiyat v'riba nami riba kol. Now I will say, so a prat and klal seems to be very similar to a miyut and a ribui, because the miyut and ribui also does that. When you have a miyut, an exclusionary phrase, and then a ribui, an inclusionary phrase, ultimately that includes everything. So the Gemara says, "Ma'ika bein miyut v'riba lepratu klal." Where lies the difference between a miyut and a ribui, and a prat and a klal? Ika di'ilu klal pratu klal marbinon afilu alin v'ula. We'll say here it is full circle. They will say, because if, for example, you were to use the exegetical principle, ultimately again of a prat and a klal, that would lead you to include even the leaves and the shoots of the vine as part of the prohibition of the Nazir. Miyut or riba, but again, if you use a miyut and a ribui, lulav and in, alin lo. Ultimately, again, shoots would be included, but leaves would not. So Rabbi say, as we close out this sugya, so here's what we have. Rabbi says, bring this all together. So first of all, just a wonderful education in Klalu Prato Klal. So we'll say, so now, first of all, what we also emerge with is everyone subscribes to the concept of both Ribui and Miut and Klal and Prat, right? They're exegetical principles. When you use them, how you use them, that is subject to dispute. We also saw the fundamental difference between a klal prat to klal and a prat to klal prat, which is really fascinating. We also saw about saying now what happens with a prat and a klal and prat and a ribui and a miut. But I will say bottom line, how do we pass in the machlokes the Tin Rabbi Lazar and the Chachamim? Right? They will say halacha l'maisa for a Nazir. We know that he's prohibited again in the three major things as outlined in the Mishnah. The shaila is what about leaves and shoots? So I will say Rambam Paskins in Hilchos Naziros. Parakeh, halacha alif, halacha beis. The Rambam says as follows. We'll do this more tomorrow, but all types of grapes are going to be aser. But he says, aval, ha'olin v'alulavim u'megifanim asada hare elu mutarin. So we'll say, the Rambam himself paskins halacha l'maisa like Rabbi Lazar. Like the Rabbanon. Namely, that leaves and shoots are going to be permitted to the Nazir. It is only the grape and everything that comes from it that is going to be asr. We'll say, shkoyach. We'll stop here for today. All right, have a great day, everyone.